All right, so the first question here that I want you to answer in your notes for yourself and think about is, what is the purpose of a court system and what do courts accomplish ideally? Today's notes are going to be about the judicial branch, and this is an introduction to the federal court system. This will be our final unit. The judicial branch comes from Article 3, Section 1 of the United States Constitution. This is the shortest section of the Constitution. It really does not provide all that much information about what the courts should do and what they look like. But what it does say is that the judicial power of the United States shall be given to one Supreme Court. So we know, according to the Constitution, we must have one Supreme Court. And that court is set up across the street from the Capitol Dome. And in such inferior courts as Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. So here we see something else. There can be other courts. They are inferior to the Supreme Court, which means they're lower, not they're like worse. They just don't have as much power, and they have to serve and do what the Supreme Court tells them, because that's the highest court in the land. So Congress, though, has the power to establish them and to create them. So really, Congress has the ability to create all the courts below the Supreme Court. There has to be a Supreme Court, but any other court is not required. That's up to Congress, which means that number can change. It can go up or down. The judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior. Now, we've talked about this. This means, as we're going to see, judges serve for life, and shall, at stated times, receive for their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. The judiciary is supported by Federalist Paper number 78. As you may recall from very early on, Federalist Papers are the essays that were written during the time where they were trying to ratify the Constitution, supporting why the Constitution should be the way it is. So Federalist 78 says that the judiciary would be the least dangerous branch of government. That being said, today some people believe that the federal courts are actually very powerful. So it's one of the questions we'll be having is, how did they go from being the least dangerous branch according to Federalist 78 to one of the most powerful? What Federalist 78 says, and is still true today, is that the courts still have two basic limitations, and you must memorize these by the end of this unit. They do not have the power of the purse, nor do they have the power of the sword. If we think about it, Congress has the power of the purse, and the executive branch has the power of the sword, money and enforcement. You will never see a Supreme Court justice enforcing their ruling. Instead, the president and his people have to enforce anything the courts say. And that's where we get. The court cannot fund a program, so if they tell someone to do something and that costs money, they can't give them the money to help them. Not only that, they can't force anyone to comply or to complete their ruling. So if they say in Brown v. Board, all schools must desegregate, unless the president and Congress back them up, they can't force states to do anything. And so states may decide, well, can't do anything to me, I'm going to ignore this. All right. So the judicial branch, everything they do comes from the power of interpretation. And in the Judiciary Act of 1789, it was said that the lower courts must do what any higher court says. The Supreme Court has used this to have very little power, and they've expanded it over time. Here's the point in the end of the Supreme Court and the judicial branch. They interpret the law in reality. Cases get brought to them as to whether someone is or is not following the law or the Constitution. They can also decide whether or not the laws themselves are legal. Are they constitutional or unconstitutional? And the judges and justices decide. Now we're going to look at the structure of the federal courts. If we look at it here, we start with the U.S. Supreme Court at top. They are the #1 top court. We're then going to have courts of appeals, and there are 13 of these, which are going to be the middle courts, and then the federal courts, the district courts, which there are 94 at the bottom. These are the inferior courts. What they decide, they have to do, and what they decide, they have to do. But if a judge makes a ruling here, these two do not have to follow it. It's just if a top court makes a decision, everyone below them on the lower levels have to do what they say. So, the lowest courts are called the district courts. As I said, there are 94. They hear about 342,000 cases per year, and they sometimes do trials by jury. And they're the only federal court that will do that. In the middle, we had the appeals court, also known as the circuit. There are actually 13 of these now. They hear about 61,000 cases a year, so not as many as district courts. They have panels of judges. No case can start in the appeals courts or the appellate courts. They only review lower court decisions, which usually start at the district court. The highest court in the land, of course, is the U.S. Supreme Court. In 2011, they issued only 75 decisions, so clearly they hear a lot fewer cases. When they do hear an appeals, this is called a writ of certiorari. We'll have a whole class on how this happens. And in general, we have what's known as the rule of 4. We need 4 justices to agree to hear a case. So to be one of those 75, 4 justices have to want to hear you, plus the Chief Justice. In this case, that is John Roberts, appointed by President Bush. Now for the history and evolution of the Supreme Court. As we've said, they started with very little power. The Constitution gave no way to enforce anything they said. No power of the purse and no power of the sword. So, how did they evolve to what they are today? Where now they seem to be making and defining policy, and they're a major part of the political process. Remember, Obama's healthcare law, 2 years of work by Congress, a lot of hard work by the states, could have been thrown out just a year later by the Supreme Court. Now they didn't, but that's power. Being able to throw out all that hard work, that's power. The answer is Marbury versus Madison of 1803. The story behind Marbury versus Madison is that Congress passed a law called the Judiciary Act of 1801, which allowed then lame duck President Adams to expand the number of federal courts and appoint justices of the peace. William Marbury got appointed during this time as the Chief Justice of the Peace in D.C., but he never got his commission, the actual papers, where he could then get the job. Then James Madison got elected. James Madison did not like Marbury, so he did not give him his papers. He refused. He said, "It's not my appointment. I'm not giving him the papers. He wasn't in place yet, so he can't have the job." So Marbury sued the government, petitioned, so that James Madison would deliver the documents to him. The court decided not to force the president to deliver, even though he was clearly violating the new law. Instead, they said the law itself was unconstitutional, and they called this judicial review. Now this was smart. It was smart because it had never been done before, where they declared a law unconstitutional. The incoming president liked the outcome, so he went ahead and supported it, and at the same time, it gave the court system a lot of power. Now, one of the big topics for this class, and it's a bit random, but we call it original jurisdiction. And what this means is who gets to hear the case first? Where do you start? The Supreme Court, in the AP exam, this might be one multiple choice question, can only hear a few kinds of cases. And this is in Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution. It can hear cases involving ambassadors, ministers, and consuls. It can hear cases on disputes in the ocean. And it can hear cases where controversies and where state is one of the parties, like the United States versus Arizona or New York versus New Jersey. Those could all go directly to the Supreme Court if the Supreme Court wants to hear the case first. So as you can see, not very many options. Appellate jurisdiction is all the other cases that have to be heard in a lower court first. So they could never be heard first at the appellate court. Typical case flow. You would start in a local district court, which would basically be in your state. So you'd start here in DC in a district court. Now, if you lose the case, you can appeal to the next level of court. In this case, it'd be the state appellate court. We're pretending we're Virginia right now. The case would then be appealed to that state court, and it'd be heard by a small panel of judges, and once again, if someone doesn't like the outcome, they can appeal. This would bring us to then the state Supreme Court. This case would be heard again by a panel of justices, and the decision is final in that state only. Again, you can appeal this decision, but this time you'd have to go to a federal court because now you've exhausted your local options. Here we have the Virginia district courts. Okay. You could then go to a federal district court. This takes the federal case originally, but also this case law would apply to the whole United States. If you don't like that decision, you could appeal again to the federal appellate court. This case law again would apply to the whole United States. It's heard by a small panel of judges. And once again, if you don't like the decision, you could appeal again. Now think about this. You've been paying a lawyer for a long time. This stuff can take years. The last level, of course, is the U.S. Supreme Court. There are 9 currently sitting justices. The decision is final and it applies to the whole United States. There is no going above the U.S. Supreme Court. Once you've gotten to this level, it is done. Here we can see a map of the court jurisdictions for the 12 circuits plus DC. And closing questions. How does a case get to the U.S. Supreme Court? What is the outcome of Marbury versus Madison? And what can the U.S. Supreme Court do? How has their power changed over time?